Hello, and welcome to the Media Copilot. It's a podcast and newsletter all about how generative AI is changing the media, journalism, and the news. I'm Pete Paschal, longtime tech journalist and founder of the Media Copilot, and on this podcast, I'm excited to bring you fascinating conversations with fellow journalists, media executives, and the people helping build the AI-driven newsrooms of the future. I'm excited this week to talk to Mike Donoghue. Mike is the CEO of Subtext, which transforms text messaging into a way to connect with audiences. Publishers use Subtext to create conversations with readers, celebrities use it to connect with fans, and all those interactions can be two-way. All you got to do is reply to the text. In a lot of ways, texting seems like the new email, and potentially a way for publishers to create a new surface to reach audiences that they control, shielded from Google, AI, and everything else. I talked to Mike about how Subtext came to be, why texting and SMS might be the last frontier for owning the audience relationship, and the role Subtext can play in a media ecosystem where AI is rapidly becoming the new platform to worry about, and perhaps to master. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. And if you did, I'd encourage you to share this podcast with a friend or colleague, and I'd be grateful if you consider subscribing to the Media Copilot newsletter if you haven't already. I'd also really appreciate it if you'd leave a rating or review in whatever podcast app you're in. Those really do help the show get in front of more people. And lastly, you can check out everything we offer, including AI training classes for media, marketing, and PR professionals at mediacopilot.ai. Okay, enough with the housekeeping. Here's my conversation with Mike Donoghue of Subtext. Mike, welcome to the Media Copilot.
Hey, Pete, thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. So, thanks for being on the show. And I really enjoy Subtext. So I'm a subscriber to at least a couple of channels that media organizations use. Definitely get stuff there that I don't get in other places. So it's sort of kind of like, I wouldn't say came out of nowhere, but the whole idea of like using text is almost like part of your content distribution system. That's a thing that's becoming more of a thing. And I'm kind of curious about how this whole thing started. How did this sort of become both a viable way to sort of get content to people as well as a viable business? So why don't you sort of take me back to the beginning and tell me how Subtext came to be?
Yeah, for sure. Well, and glad to hear that, it's a thing that's becoming a thing. I can take you through sort of the genesis of it. So Subtext were, at this point, I guess you call it like a 5-year-old startup. Originally when we were sort of coming up with like the premise for the product, we were taking a look at the media landscape, entertainment landscape, creator space, and we saw the amount of time and money and love and effort and resources that went into building up these huge audiences on social, only for a lot of these same organizations or people to kind of come to the realization that they were renting the relationships with their audience as opposed to owning a really meaningful, direct line of communication. So we knew that we wanted to facilitate that, right? Like philosophically. We thought that there were going to be a variety of ways to do it. Obviously, like the email ecosystem 5 years ago really crowded, right? Mm-hmm. So you have the Substacks of the world, Ghost, Lead, Tiny Letter, everyone is doing a really phenomenal job there. So we looked at a variety of different mediums. So we really kind of fell in love with SMS. I mean, not only for the metrics, obviously, like we send, billions and billions of messages every year. And the open rate on any of that messaging is going to be like 98%. CTR is going to be north of 30%. So, the metrics are kind of crazy. But I think what we really liked the most about it was the notion that this was like meaningful bilateral communication, right? Mm-hmm. And, it's genuinely the way that you communicate with your friends and family. So for media companies, for creators, for record labels, we love the idea that we could create like a much more personal touch point and give audiences the ability to communicate back and forth in a way that wasn't performative like social media, or would require the degree of sociopathy that you would need to like reply to an email newsletter and expect a response, right?
Yeah. So that's interesting. Just so like people sort of understand what we're talking about. So if you use Subtext, if you subscribe to one of these channels, you can reply to the thread, even though it's a group text, but it's not like your text goes back to the group. It goes to the sender. That might not be entirely obvious the first time you use it, because I remember the first time I got that if I reply to this, is everyone going to see my response? And it's kind of one of those interesting, because it's like one to many. It's kind of broadcast, but it also is a very convenient way to facilitate that back and forth on a one-to-one basis.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right? So, like, when we were originally architecting the tech behind it, we knew certainly that, like, we need to avoid, like, the reply all apocalypse, right? So, I mean, we couldn't have, we have clients on the platform that have hundreds of thousands, if not, a million plus subscribers, right? So the notion that you would have a million people replying all to one another, would have been problematic, as you can assume. But what we've liked about it too is there's certainly a subset of people in the world that are comfortable sharing their opinions or replying to content on a platform like X or Instagram or TikTok, or even email newsletters. But one of the interesting things that our clients have seen out of the platform is that look, there's a huge subset of people that wouldn't normally maybe share their opinions or share their insights in a public
right
forum. And because this is private, more direct,
mm-hmm.
and subsequently a safer space for people, there's a lot of insights that our clients glean from that bilateral communication.
Yeah, that's a really important aspect to it. It's sort of like a siloed medium inherently. I want to come back to that, because I think that has a lot of interesting consequences stem from that. But you did mention that you considered other mediums other than text. I'm actually really curious what you kind of looked at as sort of potential ideas as to create new relationships with audiences.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I'm like, I'm putting my hat back on from 5 years ago or whatever it was. But I mean, email certainly was like first and foremost, right? And, I think there's like a different way to be able to do email. I mean, it doesn't have to be this sort of like, unilateral communication channel where it's just like I hammer you with email newsletters every day. I hope that you open them, and like certainly we'll get into like the pitfalls of that as it relates to like AI and like what's going to be happening in terms of like the distillation of that content and that sort of thing. I mean, the other alternative, right, is that you end up building like some modicum of like a native app, right, where people can communicate in sort of a walled space.
Right. I feel like apps are kind of coming back a little bit. There was a long time there where they were abandoned after there was this flash in the pan in the early days of the iPhone and especially the iPad. And then everyone's like, oh, it's too much work. You get too much tech debt, blah, blah, blah. And you just do a good website that works well on mobile. And then apps sort of seem like, I don't know, I might be missing a few cycles in here, but I do feel like of late, the idea that you could also do an app has sort of gotten a little more heat in the last few years. And I think this stems from similar idea to what you're doing and newsletters, right? It's like you looking for more surfaces to sort of own the audience relationship. I think that's a very much like just obviously the trend in media right now, because we went through this whole era, to your point at the beginning, where you kind of we gave that away, media companies, right, to the platforms, and that didn't work out so well for us. So now there's a lot of different ways you can do it. Apps are one of them, but again, I don't know to what extent that probably requires a lot of investment. How different that is than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, it's really interesting to see sort of the cyclical nature of it, right? I mean, it kind of feels like 2013 again, right?
Yeah.
Where you have a lot of media companies that are looking at like, hey, how do we create more interest or more sort of habituated traffic to our homepage, or how do we invest in an app, which is considered by many to be a medium where you do sort of own the relationship with the audience. I mean, the one caveat I would put there though is that in in apps, and this is coming in newsletters as well. I mean, the notion that you own that relationship free and clear because somebody has downloaded an app is actually a little flawed. Right? I mean,
Interesting.
considering that, look, I mean, the Apple ecosystem or the Google ecosystem is going to dictate the availability of that app. It's going to dictate to a degree the functionality of that app. It's going to dictate the frequency or, the efficacy of like push notifications that you might use in that app. So, I mean, look, I think, if we're looking at opportunities to connect with audiences, free and clear, sort of big tech gatekeepers who have already proven that they have a vested interest in a lot of instances in disintermediating, let's say, media companies and their audiences. Apps are maybe not the safe space that people think they are, and I think I'm sure we'll get into it, but I think the same is true of newsletters too, right? I mean,
Right.
you Google and Apple, I believe my number is correct here, control like 84% of the email client ecosystem, right? So,
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I like where this is going because we're getting in sort of a nuanced orbit of control almost, where you're right that the app, there's a lot of platform control over how that works. And then you get sort of a layer out. Well, email seems like it is universal, but if you think about what the email apps people use, you're right. It's Outlook, it's Gmail, it's Apple's mail app. And we're already seeing with the glut of newsletters. I keep hearing we're at peak newsletter. I'm not sure exactly when that happened, but I get the point. We're kind of saturated. I myself do a newsletter. There's a lot of them, and so we're starting to see within apps, these client apps, that they're sort of shuffling them off. There's going to be like filtering the newsletters and putting them in a tab, which makes sense. It's sort of it was probably inevitable. Text is like one more layer out, right? And I wouldn't say the platforms have no say. We're certainly seeing like, that there's more tech input to that. But it seems like the logic is similar to newsletters in that, obviously you understand that, you have this notification you get. You can sort of immediately be a front and center in the user experience on the device they use all the time. But with text, it's even more immediate and more personal, it feels like, right? Like you can, and there's less intermediation, at least at this point. Who knows what's going to happen 5 years, 10 years down the road as all these platforms evolve. But it seems like the case that everyone was making for newsletters 10 or so years ago is now much more applicable to text.
I think that's absolutely right, to be honest with you, right? I mean, there is, look, as much as we might want to deny it, or, it's kind of, people say like jokingly, like, okay, we've reached peak newsletter and that type of thing. I mean, the truth is like, there is a limit to the amount of content that people can or will consume via email in a given day. And I think, the efficacy of email sort of rises and falls on people's willingness to like open it, consume it, and engage with it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, email in general is like a really passive experience, right? And, I subscribe to tons of email newsletters, yours included, right? And I think, you do an amazing job and it's super insightful. And I get everything that I need to get from it. But, you also have to, like, for a lot of media companies right now that might be resource constrained, you have to look at the amount of time and effort and resources that are poured into creating a daily email newsletter, because it's not easy, right? I mean, it requires a significant amount of work. Compare that to your open rate and your engagement rate and ask yourself, what the real return on investment here looks like, one, and two, what your use of this medium is doing to like further humanize like you as an individual or a brand if you're a large media company. And the truth is, like, I think email newsletters are always going to be table stakes, but we talk with a lot of executives at media companies, big and small, and one of the things that we're hearing is like, look, we need to prepare for a post-email world because not only generationally do folks in Gen Z like not spend as much time with their email, but we know that they're spending a tremendous amount of time in any of their messaging apps, right? And I think short, punchy, engaging content via SMS that gets opened at 98% and requires 10 minutes to create ends up, coming out as a better ROI at the end of the day, right? Versus spending the entire day to write an email newsletter to get an 18 or 22% open rate on that newsletter.
Totally. It also seems like it's aligning with attention spans, come to think of it, like rather than the newsletter, the lengthy ones, which are good. I do lengthy ones sometimes, often actually, being able to sort of compress that into texts, that's sort of meeting the audience more where they are as things evolve. So this my thing is AI, so we got to talk about AI at some point. But you did mention that obviously you're talking to publishers all the time and figuring out the strategies that they use to use subtext. I am curious what you're hearing about how they are thinking about AI right now. We're obviously at a weird transitional time with respect to AI and media. And we are starting to see all these deals happening with licensing agreements, presumably as a new sort of frontier to distribute in a way that's sort of fundamentally different than we've seen before, because you're seeing this transformative summarization, which is probably best shown by Perplexity right now. But I mean, what are you hearing? What are people saying? Is there a lot of fear about platforms sort of taking over again? It feels like everyone wants to learn the lesson of the scale media era where we gave everything away to platforms, but it kind of feels like that's playing out again in a way. So what are your sort of summarized thoughts based on the conversations that you've had over the past few months about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right. Look, I think every media company that we talk to recognizes that like AI is going to be here. It's going to be the future. You can't opt out of the future in this scenario. So the question is like, how do we play most effectively in this space? And certainly, you've seen certain publishers create, distribution deals or licensing deals with some of the major AI platforms. But I think like the overarching sort of feeling or like temperature that we get out there in the space is like there's a lot of consternation, there's a lot of hand wringing when Gemini gets released, and it's very, very easy to see that like, okay, Gemini is going to be distilling content that we as a media company have spent a lot of time and money to create. They're going to be disintermediating us on search results pages. We used to find like a really meaningful safe haven in our search results pages. We knew how to operate our SEO operations. We knew what referral traffic was going to look like. We knew that if we wrote the story about what time the Super Bowl starts and we optimized it the right way, we were going to make X amount of dollars, right? And I think like those days are over. I mean, Gemini has sort of put an end to that, right? So the overarching sort of the marching orders or the initiatives that we're seeing out of a lot of the media companies is like, look, I need to sort of get back to the roots of facilitating audience relationships in like a sustainable and fully owned way. Because you're right, the media industry learned a lot of hard lessons out of the platform era, right? Which is that we're building our business on somebody else's land here. So when algorithms shift or monetization policies change or grant programs are no longer available, this can have a really meaningful impact on the business. So, there's a huge push towards owned relationships, improved first-party data, and the ability to sort of action any of that first-party data into, engaging audiences or reducing subscriber churn or, any of the other sort of big calls to action for media at this point. So, for some people, it's a wait and see. For, I think, the more innovative or progressive folks, they're pushing a lot of resources that they would have formerly had for, earmarked for SEO or earmarked for social into channels that they can own as opposed to rent.
And do you see AI playing a role there? And I'm not talking about the platforms themselves, but like the technology. And so, if if the OpenAI and Google and others are showing the viability of this chat experience, essentially this summarization experience on a broad level, is that applicable on a more focused level, like on a media sites platform that could manifest just simply as a sort of, your chat with the New York Times, with the Wall Street Journal, with whatever it is, and that suddenly becoming a thing. So you have these sort of chat fiefdoms all over, in addition to sort of licensing content to the bigger platforms, right? Is there some talk about that? I do see sort of chat sort of being experimented with a little bit here and there, but I don't think it's really progressed much more than that. Do you have any sense of it?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. Oh, and by the way, Pete, I'm going to steal chat fiefdoms. I love that. That's
Feel
great.
free.
That's great.
Chat
Yeah, I
warlords,
mean,
perhaps. I don't know.
magnanimous warlords. I don't know. But yeah, so I mean, look, there's going to be a lot of experimentation there. I think, if we look back in 2, 3, 4 years and see sort of like the chat experience that would have been facilitated by like the AI that's out there today, I think we'll laugh at like how sort of rudimentary it seemed, and that's an easy prognostication for me to make, because I mean the tech is evolving so quickly, right? I think what it's really bringing to the forefront though is this notion that like there is sort of a hierarchy in terms of like quality of content at all publishers, right? And
Sure.
I think like historically you've always had the baseline sort of foundational content that, like, while not groundbreaking from an editorial standpoint or from like a domain knowledge standpoint, is sort of your bread and butter, right? This is like the SEO content. It's
Yeah.
what time the Super Bowl starts and that sort of thing, right?
And
I think
aggregated stuff I would throw into there too. Yeah.
exactly. And what I think you'll see happen in the not too distant future is like, using AI to accentuate the domain knowledge of a lot of like really skilled journalists at these media companies, right? So, I think of somebody like Sarah Fisher, right? Or Pete, what? Like, I listen to the podcast, I read the newsletter, I consume the content on site. Obviously, your opinion, Sarah's opinions, the work that's going on in the space, her access is hugely important to me. Like, that's really valuable. I know that I need to be able to read that content. Now, can you or Sarah scale a chat experience to the point where you can respond to every single audience member one-on-one who maybe has deeper questions or wants to go a level below the cursory content? No, I mean, you're never going to be able to do that, right? So I love the notion that in a lot of instances, AI is going to accentuate the importance of domain knowledge and experience and access and quality reporting, while sort of obfuscating the need for a lot of like table stakes aggregate content. And I think AI, just like as a tool, as a tech, will continue to be used to sort of accentuate that knowledge. And it's going to be really interesting. I mean, we're not even in like the first inning at this point. Like, we're still singing the national anthem, so we'll see.
Oh, that's good. I don't know if I've heard exactly that. Definitely heard the first inning analogy with the national anthem. Yeah. So you gave me some ideas there about what subtext's role could be in sort of this future, and maybe even how AI could play a part in that. So, to your point, you said earlier some people on Subtext have really big followings. Like, they might have 100,000, hundreds of thousands, or a million followers. They could never really reply to everyone who replies back. Could AI help surface the right things? Maybe it does, or I don't know if you're using AI at all on your platform, but it seems to me, even within sort of a walled domain like that relationship, just having some AI assistance to kind of sort conversations might be helpful. And then trying to sort of, like, in some ways, scale that one-to-one relationship in some ways. But then again, to your point, the other side of that is, like, if it's not you, is it really working? Is that the point, right? I don't know. And it really kind of depends on the quality of the AI and other things, but I don't know. How are you thinking about AI and certainly with some of your bigger clients, how it might be used?
Yeah. Well, so I guess let me start by telling you something that we're never going to do, right?
Cool.
So we are never going to use AI to fake a conversation with any of our journalists or any of our artists or any of our media companies. I think, one of the unique benefits of our platform is that by and large, right, you are communicating directly with, the artist or the journalist or the media company in sort of an unfiltered, unfettered way, right? And I think, that betraying that personal
Mm,
connection for us is, really sort of us abandoning like one of the core tenets of the business. But I think to
totally.
your point, I think to your point, the using AI to like, I'll give you a real example, right? So, Miley Cyrus did her album release on our platform, right? And, it was communicated to her biggest fans, before it was communicated publicly. And as you might imagine, like hundreds of thousands of people had like really great opinions and they were very excited and they were replying back. It's one of the beauties of the medium, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
very simple to send a text back. And our clients see all of those texts. Like they come into the dashboard, you can consume them. What we love about it and what we think is interesting as it relates to AI is like, okay, so we sent a message to 1 million people. We got 800,000 responses. How can we synthesize those responses
Mm,
and bubble up sort of actionable insights for our clients? I think that's really interesting. I think similarly, using AI to be able to listen to audiences at scale and then better understand their content preferences is really interesting. So, like today, for example, if you subscribe to media company A and we ask you a question, hey, are you interested in politics or tech or business or breaking news? And you reply back, we're going to be listening to the response that you've sent back to that host, and we can automatically sort of put you into new addressable audiences based on the preferences that you've expressed there, right? Which is
mm.
again kind of a cool sort of differentiated use of like the bilateral communication. But sorry,
Yeah.
does that make sense?
No, that makes sense. Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of what I was getting at. It's more about the sorting. And certainly, like, I was never thinking like you should fake a conversation. I think that violates just some basic ethics. There might be, I don't know, and maybe this is against the spirit of it, if not the letter of the law, like with disclosure of what you're interacting with. Is that maybe a viable thing? Maybe, probably not, even though, because again, it's more like the spirit of the platform is that one to one. But all of this it gets me thinking a bit about just the platform itself. And this might be a very kind of dumb and obvious observation, but it's like this texting threads that you have ongoing with an audience. I mean, it's content, right? And it's like it's kind of this walled off content. And again, I'm not an expert on how web crawlers work, but it feels like, oh, this is a way you can create some content and potentially even some IP in a smaller way with your audience in a way that isn't like necessarily quote unquote safe, but isn't that is again something you kind of own and can repurpose, repackage, and do with what you want. And it's one of those things where whenever I think anyone thinks about creating like a website today or any kind of content operation, you think about the open web and what's going on with AI, and it gives you pause.
Mhm.
And you're going to really want to have more of these sort of channels that you own. Sort of circling around a question there, but it's more like the how I guess are your clients thinking about that? Is it something that is more like they're repackaging stuff to put into these conversations and also taking the sort of stuff they're doing there, the conversations, and turning that into content elsewhere? I suppose it's probably a bit two way.
Yeah, so it's a great question and like a really astute insight too, in terms of like the value that the platform throws off, right? So like, I'll give you an example, like even from the earliest days when we were operating the platform. So like, when COVID happened, right? So, we had any number of newsrooms that knew that they needed to cover COVID on the local level. They certainly did not have, the people power to be in every city in the United States, but they had massive subscriber bases on our platform. And one of the things that they did was, they sent out basically a request for people to take photos of the shelves at their grocery store, or the way that they were doing sort of like mask mandates in schools, or whatever it's going to be, right? And like, it turned out to be a really powerful, scalable UGC type of platform with like a very low barrier to entry, right? It's like, I don't need to download an app. I can literally take a photo of, the grocery store shelves and send it to you if you're, BuzzFeed or USA Today or like any of those clients. And that was really powerful, right? And, that sort of same spirit continues today, which is that, I'll give you another real life example. So like Maggie Rogers is a client of ours, right? And she had some singles that she was going to be releasing, and her fans were thrilled about it. And like, part of what she did was accept voice memos from fans, right? So like, I record a voice memo, I send it to Maggie. Maggie fielded all of that content and then listened to it and sort of reacted to it on social. And it was like a really fantastic way for fans to literally have their voices heard by the artist that they so much admired, and was terrific participatory content for Maggie and the team, right? So there's a lot of IP that gets created within these conversations that again is not broadly available on the open web, right? And I think like one of the really interesting things too is that it's not it's not something that is difficult to understand. Like, this is sort of a pitch and catch in terms of like the question and response type of content. So we think there's a lot of value there.
Nice. So let's get a little forward looking here in terms of, the whole sort of media ecosystem. So we've been talking a lot about finding new surfaces to interact with audiences. Subtext is definitely one of them. We've been talking about AI. Certainly it's here to stay. Certainly it's going to get better. It's going to become more pervasive in some way, although, we're currently sort of experiencing a bit of an uptick in backlash. So that notwithstanding, what does it look like in 5 years, or 10 years as the media system evolves, assuming these trends continue and publishers really double down on these direct relationships, but AI also just becomes more pervasive? What's a healthy media ecosystem look like then? And what is Subtext role? I keep almost saying Substack. I'm sorry.
No, it's all good. So the question primarily is like, what does a healthy media ecosystem look like in the not too distant future, and maybe
Right.
far in distant future?
Totally.
So it's going to be really interesting. I think there has to be, right, like a really meaningful shift in terms of like the way that media companies are communicating with audiences today. I think again, the notion that we write a lot of sort of duplicative content, and then we duke it out on search results pages for referral traffic, and then we subsequently monetize via advertising based on that referral traffic. I think like that is sort of a notion that is going to fade into the background, right? So, and probably for the best. I think like that is sort of a healthy evolution in the space in terms of the value that media companies are creating for audiences. So I think what you'll see, my opinion at least, is a real sort of diversification and investment in both the mediums and the individuals that can strike a sustainable balance with the audiences and creating more participatory experiences for them. So I touched on it before, but like the notion that we're hiring journalists that have a really deep domain knowledge that are creating a lot of value, maybe not for the biggest audience possible, but in a really potent way, I think is going to be interesting. Because like the idea that like we're going for sheer quantity and scale of audience is sort of a dead notion, right? So we need to focus on quality of those relationships, quality of the mediums that we're using to reach people in, and drawing any of those audience members into the experience. Because like if you look at the monetization models for media companies, right, like so much of it now is predicated on subscriptions, right?
Right.
And eventually like we're going to bounce off the wall in terms of like the saturation point for subscriptions for a lot of media organizations. So if you don't have the ability to pour more sand in the top of the bucket, you've got to narrow the aperture through which that sand runs at the bottom of the bucket. So we need to do a better job of engaging audiences. We need to do a better job of proving out the value of our subscriptions, and subsequently keeping people around. And I think there's a huge opportunity for media companies to bring their audiences into the fold, right? We touched on the BuzzFeed example. We touched on what somebody like Maggie Rogers would do. And I think generationally it speaks to, the expectations of a lot of younger audience members that are used to, creating content themselves or like further personalizing their experiences. So I realize that's like a roundabout way to answer your question, but hopefully that's helpful.
No, it's very helpful. And I'd like to just end on maybe reversing that and touching on the very sort of last thing you said about the audiences, which is what is a healthy audience media diet look like in that same era, right? Obviously we're talking a lot about the perspective of media companies, journalists, and the value of content, but looking at just habits, and we don't really know exactly what is going to be like our smartphones are going to look like in 5 years, or if we have all doing augmented reality classes, or we have TikTok on our watches or something like that. But how do you sort of think about sort of what an audience, where the audience is going in the not too distant future?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. We're going all in on Neuralink, Pete. Yeah, I mean, look, I think the media consumption is always going to trail sort of broader consumption habits for all media, right? So if that's going to be television streaming, if that's going to be an uptick in short form video platforms like TikTok or something like that, like I think media is always going to trail that to a degree, and with some difference baked in for like generational preferences and that sort of thing. But I think broadly, like you'll see media company and consumers, right, try and strike a balance between their use of the social platforms, their use of email as like a much more passive medium, likely their use of SMS as a more active participatory medium. And I think there's going to be sort of growing opportunities. You're already seeing this for media, whether or not you're doing like in-person events, or whether or not you're doing like speaker series, AMA, it's like that type of thing. I think that will continue to proliferate as well. And look, I think for the media companies that have earned sort of the trust and the respect and the habituation of users, the what's old is new again, right? It's like 2013 homepages, apps, that sort of thing. I think those will continue to do well, right? I think what's likely going to suffer as a result is consumption of like traditional news media on like certain social platforms, right? Like you can see the devolution of like the quality of content on a platform like X, right?
Sure.
You can see it to a degree on Instagram or TikTok or that sort of thing. It's like, look, algorithmically, it's just not trustworthy. It's not all that compelling. And look, those are mediums that maybe people don't want to consume news in, right? So foisting content into those channels maybe not the best bet. But it's a long way of saying I think any of this is going to be sort of a balanced diet. But I think thematically within that diet, we're going to see an increased focus on audience ownership, direct engagement, and the facilitation of more participatory experiences for consumers. Right.
Appreciate it, Mike. This has been a great conversation. Excited to see where you guys go next.
Thanks so much, Pete. Really appreciate it. And congrats on all this success.
Oh, well, likewise. Thanks for listening to my conversation with Mike Donoghue. If you want to check out Subtext, head on over to joinsubtext.com. And if you like what you heard, please just take a minute to leave a rating or review for the Media Copilot in your podcast app. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Media Copilot newsletter and check out mediacopilot.ai for our classes on AI for journalists, marketers, and content creators. Be seeing you in the future.